What does an infinity mean? What does it mean for something to be infinite? And how can such an abstract concept and idea influence and shape the scientific tradition? And what would it mean for a culture, a community, a society that did not have a concept of what infinity is? What would it mean and what would it do to their worldview if they were to adopt such a concept? It's a strange thought. It's a strange thought to me as a historian, but we do have some historical examples of this. Specifically, who I'm going to be focusing on in this video is Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, who was a German cardinal in the 15th century. I think Nicholas's dates are 1401 through 1460-ish, 65, 64, 65-ish. And Nicholas kind of represents a historical bridge, so to speak, between what can be identified as the medieval and scholastic philosophy. Think, for example, of Thomas Aquinas is probably the most preeminent scholastic philosopher in the beginning of the Renaissance and the early modern period. And one of the ideas that Nicholas is really going to wrestle with is this concept of infinity, and specifically how this concept of infinity challenged traditional cosmological ideas. Now, Nicholas is an interesting figure for many reasons. He is a church cardinal. He dabbles in things like linguistics, mathematics, cosmology, theology. He represents a very interesting tradition within Christian theology. This tradition is kind of known as negative theology, which is associated with certain movements in Christian mysticism. And in his writing, Nicholas is going to take all of that and have some cosmological musings, so to speak. So I'm going to take this video to explore what I think personally, this is a subjective opinion, what are Nicholas's some of his more interesting ideas, and this is something that has been identified by the French historian and philosopher Alexandre Koyré. And Nicholas is one of the first people to really wrestle with this concept of infinity and explore how this concept of infinity challenged, which at his time was the traditional cosmological understanding and model of the universe, which was the Aristotelian slash Ptolemaic model. So, despite the fact that he was a cardinal, and despite the fact that Nicholas had a day job, he studied canon law and was a prominent member within the church. He spent his free time reading and writing and engaging with philosophy and mathematics. He published several books over the course of his life. The one that I'm going to be focusing on is a book titled On Learned Ignorance, and this is a reflection of his theological views, but within this book, he's also going to have some of his cosmological musings. I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about Nicholas, I'm going to link a video lecture that gives a very detailed outline and overview of both Nicholas's life and his more academic and scholarly pursuits if you're looking to do more of a deep dive. As I mentioned before, this video is a result. I'm reading back through Alexandre Koyré's From the Closed World to the Infinite Universe. The book itself is a little bit dated by today's standard, but as if you've watched any of my other videos, I'm really interested in early 20th century French historical epistemology and the philosophy and the history and the philosophy of science. And Koyré is really one of the most preeminent figures in that field. He kind of started that field, so to speak. Koyré is the equivalent of in the English speaking world of like a Thomas Kuhn, whose book kind of started and founded really the history of science. Doesn't really become an academic area until the early to mid part of the 20th century, and figures like Koyré are a major part of why that is the case. But the first chapter of Koyré's book, he deals with this idea. As the title suggests, Koyré is focusing on this more intellectual shift, what he calls a closed or a finite universe, is we'll talk about in the Aristotelian or the Ptolemaic model, to what happens in the early modern period. Koyré is going to mostly focus on like Galileo, but what happens in the early modern period where we have one of the most radical cosmological shifts in intellectual history, at least, a shift from a closed universe, a very small universe in the Aristotelian model, to our notion of the universe today, which for us seems commonplace, but to an ancient person or even to a medieval person would be a radically new idea in model. It just really wouldn't make sense. And Cusa, as Koyré identifies, is really one of the first people to wrestle with this idea of what it means to be in an infinite universe. And it has some interesting implications for Cusa's epistemology and his theology, his conception of God. Like this idea of infinity changes how he thinks of God, or it might be vice versa. That would be up to Nicholas scholars, but I'll get into a little bit of that. Now, although I'm going to be talking about Nicholas within the context of his cosmological views, I do want to point out the fact that he is first and foremost a theologian. He's a cardinal of the church. And even then, he's not a theologian in the same way that, like, Aquinas is a theologian. He's a theologian. That's not his day job. His day job is analyzing, reviewing, and implementing cardinal law. His day job is not commenting on or teaching people theology. He's not an instructor. He's not a professor. This is not his primary area of focus and expertise. And the same can be said about Nicholas's reflections on cosmology. He's not an astronomer. He's not paid to be an astronomer. He's not predicating or basing his ideas on any sort of astronomical evidence. And I'm even talking about astronomical evidence within the context of his time period. He's not examining and analyzing star charts. He's not going out every night and doing his own observations. He's not to be, if you want to put this like, he's not to be, when I think of him, I don't put him in the same sort of category, so to speak, as early Renaissance mathematicians and astronomers, people like Copernicus or Osiander. He's not a pure mathematician in any way, shape, or form, but he is very up to date and very knowledgeable about the things that are happening during his time period. And he is, I think, in a unique position in that he's able to recognize kind of this shifting intellectual current, specifically around cosmology and mathematics. Nicholas puts a very interesting emphasis on the importance of mathematics that you really don't see in the medieval period. Nicholas is going to frame mathematics and mathematical knowledge as a way to coming to know and to understand the universe in a way that is like decades, if not centuries, ahead of his time. The fact of the matter is that it's not really until Galileo that we have this emphasis on mechanical knowledge and the use of mathematics as a tool to understand and to come to know nature. You see this kind of foreshadowed in movements like the Renaissance, but Nicholas is writing well before any of this other stuff happened. And so it's interesting to see Nicholas kind of anticipate the sorts of arguments that are to come. So in that way, he is kind of on the cutting edge of the intellectual trends of his era. What I also think is interesting about Nicholas, just from my own personal perspective, is if you've followed my channel at all, you know that I review a lot of apologetic arguments about the nature of science and the history of science. And one of the things that I oftentimes hear repeated by apologists is this idea that science is somehow predicated on the idea that the universe is intelligible or knowable, that we have to have this assumption in order to come to do and to understand science, and that this assumption is something that is inherited uniquely from Christianity over and against other religious traditions. What's I find incredibly fascinating about Nicholas with his tradition of negative theology actually begins from the opposite assumption, and that this opposite assumption informs his cosmological position As a negative theologian, Nicholas is beginning from the premise that God, and by extension, reality, as we'll see in some of his writing, is inherently unknowable or intelligible, or that there are very strict limits to what human beings are capable of knowing. God being one of those things. We cannot begin to comprehend something that is infinite. It is absolutely beyond the confines of the ability of human rationality. And if the universe represents an infinity, or as we'll see, this word infinity needs some context. If the universe is as large as modern cosmology says it is, it might also be beyond the limits of our rational capability of understanding what exactly that means. Ultimate reality, according to Nicholas, is unintelligible, or I shouldn't say unintelligible, is beyond rational grasp, is beyond rational intuition or understanding. And to that point, I want to begin this conversation by talking about Nicholas's understanding of negative theology and very briefly dipping our toes into what negative theology is. I was lucky enough in my educational training to be able to take a class on Christian mysticism. I kind of took it just because I needed a class to take. This was in graduate school. But it came to be one of my favorite classes just because I'd never really encountered, when you think of Christianity, there are certain types of Christianity that comes to mind. If you're thinking like historic, you might think of like the Roman Catholic Church or the Greek Orthodox Church or something along those lines. But the mystical tradition, from a theological perspective, just begins from completely different grounding than most Christian theology. And I'm not really going to take the time to give it the sort of academic treatment that it deserves, but if you're interested in it, you can look up Christian mysticism. You can look up, the common word for it is negative theology or apophatic theology, as it's sometimes called. Some of the major historical figures within this tradition include Nicholas, who we're talking about today. It begins with an author called Pseudo-Dionysius, who is a very interesting figure. You can begin with the Wikipedia page. There's also a World History of Encyclopedia page and a Stanford Encyclopedia page on Pseudo-Dionysius and on Christian mysticism and negative theology. If you're interested, I'll link some of those resources below. We have a quote here by Deidre Carabine, which I believe summarizes the basic tenets of negative theology that will kind of help us understand Nicholas's position. So I'm just going to use her words to explain this. So Pseudo-Dionysius describes the cataphatic or the affirmative way to the divine as a way of speech. Affirmative theology is that we are able to uniquely identify, name, and describe the attributes and the character of God. That we can come to some sort of understanding of the transcendent by attributing all the perfections of the created order to God as its source. In this sense, we can say things like God is love, God is beauty, God is good. So affirmative theology is being able to say or to list the positive attributes, characteristics, manifestations of God, to describe God in a positive, a linguistically positive way, not in a positive way in the sense that we're saying nice things about God, but that our language, our positive language about God, is actually referring to something. The apophatic or the negative way stresses God's absolute transcendence and unknowability in such a way that we cannot say anything about the divine essence because God is totally beyond being. Any sort of attribute, any sort of description of God is ultimately going to fall short. Not only is it going to fall short, but it might even be, at worst, a form of idolatry to attribute to God something that God is not. But at the very least, it's limiting God. It's putting God within a linguistic or conceptual box. The dual concept of the immanence and transcendence of God can help us to understand the simultaneous truth of both ways to God. At the same time, as God is immanent, God is also transcendent. At the same time, God is knowable, God is also unknowable. God cannot be thought of as one or the other only. God transcends any sort of limitations, categories, or descriptions that we put on God. And the negative theologians and negative theology, the tradition that comes out of that, will emphasize the fact that any sort of human linguistic conception of God is ultimately going to fall short or fail to capture the exact thing that God is. And we see this expressed by Nicholas in his book on the hidden God. I have just a very short excerpt from a conversation. It's framed as a dialogue between a pagan and a Christian, and we'll see this idea of negative theology expressed here. The pagan says, I see you prostrated most devoutly and weeping tears of love, not false tears, but from the heart. Tell me who you are. Christian, I am a Christian. What are you worshiping? God. Who is the God you worship? I do not know. How can you so earnestly worship that which you do not know? It is because I do not know that I worship. So, negative theology is very paradoxical when you first start studying, because you'll hear negative theologians say things like they don't know God, or God is beyond all categories, even the category of being. So, God is both being and not being at the same time, because these categories, these ontological, metaphysical categories, can't even be applied to God. And for Nicholas, this is also the case. He worships God, but when asked who God is, his response is, I don't know. But as you can see in the last part of that, this unknowing is the basis for his worshiping. It's why he's worshiping, because God is so far beyond his intellectual capabilities. So, just to set the stage here before we get into his cosmological reflections, the models that Nicholas is responding to derive largely from the ancient Greek models from the Greek philosopher Aristotle and Ptolemy. And once you combine the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic schools, especially by the turn of the millennium, you have a pretty consistent cosmological model that's shared throughout Europe. And this is presented as a model in which I have a diagram here from a book, the model in which you have the Earth at the center of the universe. Now, people of this time period, when you say universe, again, it's not our understanding of the universe. They meant something completely different for this. So the universe for them consisted of the Earth. The Earth is at the center. The Earth is surrounded. I'll use my microphone here. So the my microphone is the Earth, and surrounding the Earth, orbiting the Earth in perfect circles. Sometimes these circles are represented as crystalline spheres. I mean, they completely had a different concept, not only of the universe, but of space and what existed in space and how space was structured. Space was structured very hierarchically, as we'll see. The Earth is the center, yes, because the Earth is more important, so to speak, because that's where human beings are. But the Earth, you also have to remember, is a place of decay and change. People, animals, life on Earth, the weather on Earth is constantly changing. Human beings, of course, are being born, yes, but we're all growing old and dying. The Earth is a place of corruption, but humans occupy that unique place because we're the ones that were uniquely put here by God. If we're talking about the Christian tradition, and even within the Greek tradition, we're in a unique place because we're observing all of these planets and stars moving around us. But the Earth is the center, and around the Earth, you have planets or stars. Planets, they believe that the moon was a planet, right? Mars, Venus. But you also, and that was space. And it was believed later on that planets such as Mars kind of rolled around these crystalline spheres. And these were solid spheres that encompassed the Earth. They were crystalline, so they were see through, so you didn't see the sphere itself, you just saw space. But the planets moved around these spheres. And the outermost sphere was the sphere of the fixed stars. These were the stars, if you go outside and look up at the night sky, these are the stars that don't move. And that was the universe. There was nothing, it wouldn't really make sense to talk about what was beyond the realm of the fixed stars. That was it. We have a more 3D model that might help you conceptually, pictorially think about this in your mind. But again, we're talking about a sphere. Oftentimes it's kind of cut in half to help us conceptualize this. But this is what the philosopher and the historian of science Thomas Kuhn called the two-sphere model. You have the sphere of the Earth, which sat at the center, and then you have the heavenly sphere. And the heavenly spheres were thought to be perfect, mathematically perfect. They moved in perfect circles around the Earth. But more importantly, from an Aristotelian perspective, it was believed that the cosmology of the heavens were perfect in the sense that they didn't change. Not only did their orbits not change, but remember, the Earth is a place of corruption, but other stars and things in the heavens were not corrupted. They were the same, they were immutable forever. That's why the observation of comets in the 15th and 16th centuries are going to be so challenging, because the heavens were perfect, the Earth was not perfect. The change that happened in the universe happened on Earth, not in the heavens. So Koyré is going to argue that with the early modern thinkers, Descartes, Galileo, Newton, we get a new understanding of the universe, a shift away, much like Kuhn would describe, a shift away from that two-sphere model to a larger, a bigger understanding of the universe. And once we get to Newton, we get this idea of an infinite universe. Both time and space, according to Newton, are infinite, and by extension, the universe itself, the universe as we know it and inhabit it, is also infinite. So Nicholas, in this respect, becomes kind of a bridge between these two traditions. As we'll see, his understanding of infinity is not the early modern notion of infinity, but it's also not the medieval scholastic notion of infinity. What's important here is that with Nicholas, we get a rejection of the finitude of the Aristotelian system, that idea of the realm of the fixed stars and the realm of the planets. Nicholas is really going to argue for an expansion of that universe, and with it, a rejection of the realm of the fixed stars, the outermost crystalline sphere, rejection of that, and a rejection of this idea that we know that the Earth is the center of the universe. Going back to his understanding of negative theology, Nicholas is not going to be proposing that the universe itself is actually infinite, but rather is going to say that our understanding of the universe has to be inherently indeterminate, that we cannot know whether or not it's finite or it's infinite. But by saying that is where we get the rejection of the Aristotelian system and the need for a new understanding. Essentially, the statement that the universe is the center or is finite in scale is beyond the scope of human knowledge. So we can't say that the Earth is the center. We can't say that the realm of the fixed stars is the end of a finite universe. So with that, I want to actually read this quote by Nicholas. Again, this is from his book on learned ignorance. The quote by saying that the universe is triune in that there is nothing that is not a unity of potentiality, actuality, and connecting motion, that no one of these can subsist absolutely without the other, and that all of these are in all things in different degrees, so different that in the universe no two things can be completely equal to each other in everything. Accordingly, if we consider the diverse motions of the celestial boards, we find that it is impossible for the machine of the world to have any fixed and motionless center, be it at the sensible earth, for air, for fire, or for anything else. For there can be no absolute minimum in motion, that is, no fixed center, because the minimum must necessarily coincide with the maximum. So as you can hopefully tell from the small selection that I just read, Nicholas's argument is not predicated on any sort of astronomical observations or some sort of correction from data from star tables or anything like that. Nicholas, as I mentioned before, is not some kind of unknown precursor to Copernicus or Galileo. The basis of these reflections are rooted, I think, are rooted in his notion of theology and his negative theology and the unknowability of God. And by extension, the unknowability of God, we have the unknowability, the unknownness, unknowability, the incomprehensibility of the universe. And we also get thrown in here some logic and reasoning borrowed from some paradoxes of mathematics. He's going to incorporate mathematical reasoning into his theology, and here we have it applied to cosmology as a whole. And I think what he's getting at is from these mathematical paradoxes, if knowledge is indeterminate, if we can't say that the universe is finite, then what does it mean once we start introducing units of measurement? Right? Because to say that the Earth is the center is to posit some sort of measurements. The Earth is the center of the what? The Earth is the center of the universe. So we can say that the universe, that there's a definite circumference of the universe around the Earth. Well, now we're talking about geometry here. But in what sense, this is from Nicholas's perspective, once we break that mold of finitude, he's really introducing, this is really interesting to me. We really get this understanding of the relativity of motion, right? The Earth is the center of the universe. Center to what? How are we able to make that sort of claim if we're getting rid of this idea of finitude? So if the finitude of the Aristotelian universe is dissolved, then there's no standard or basis for the measurements of the celestial bodies. Any one region of space is not any more absolute or standard than any other region of space. Going back to that last line, if there's no absolute minimum of motion and subsequently no absolute maximum of motion, then there's no basis to posit an absolute center or standard of the universe. And we have one more quote from Nicholas to close us out. Nicholas goes on to say, though the world is not infinite, so he's not positing an absolute infinite or that the universe is absolutely infinite. Though the world is not infinite, yet it cannot be conceived as finite. So we get this paradox since it has no limits between which it is confined. The earth, therefore, which cannot be the center, cannot be lacking in all motion, but it is necessary that it move in such a way that it could be moved infinitely less. Just as the earth is not the center of the world, so the sphere of the fixed stars is not its circumference. Going back to what I was saying earlier, though if we compare the earth to the sky, the earth appears to be nearer the center from our perspective in the sky to the circumference. So we get Nicholas here playing around with these paradoxes of mathematics, playing around with the idea that if we don't conceive of the universe as finite, if we're introducing this idea, maybe not even of an actual infinity, but the notion of infinity, what does that do to our astronomical knowledge? And in Nicholas's case, what does that do to our theological knowledge? And so we have this very interesting gap, I think, Koyré thinks. By the way, if you haven't done so already, please go check out Koyré. I mean, I'm not like promoting he's been deceased for a while now, but it's a good read. I would highly recommend it. But we have in Nicholas this sort of interesting bridge, this intellectual bridge between the late scholastics and the early Renaissance, early modern thinkers, at least with respect to cosmology. I'm looking forward to reading through the rest of Koyré. I'll make some more videos on this. You can kind of view this as my little commentary on Koyré. This was with respect to the first chapter, as I mentioned at the beginning. Let me know if you have any thoughts, any questions. I'd be very curious to hear from you, and I'll see you all next time.